The heavy rain of Chicago lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian penthouse, distorting the glittering city lights into abstract smears of gold and red. David Wright stood perfectly still, the cold glass of his whiskey tumbler pressing against his palm. On the marble kitchen island lay a plain manila envelope. No return address, just his name. Beside it, his newly polished platinum anniversary watch ticked steadily. A gift from Emma just 3 days ago to celebrate 7 years of what he thought was an immaculate marriage. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the glossy photographs inside. The first image was a candid shot taken outside the Sapphire Lounge. Emma, his elegant, composed wife, was pressed against the brick wall in the alley, her hands frantically gripping the lapels of a man who was not him. Her eyes were closed in desperate surrender. The ticking of the watch suddenly sounded like a countdown to an explosion. The perfect life David knew was a beautifully constructed lie, and the detonator was right in his hands. If stories of dark secrets, silent betrayals, and the devastating price of forbidden desires speak to you, stay with me. This is just the beginning of a descent into a nightmare where love is a weapon, and mercy is a luxury no one can afford. The rain in Chicago had a way of sounding like secrets, a relentless, whispering hiss against the glass that drowned out everything else. David Wright stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse in the Meridian, looking down at the grid of the city. He was 36, a senior executive at Pemberton Tech, a man who built his life on algorithms, predictability, and control. Tonight, however, control was slipping through his fingers like water. On the kitchen island of imported Italian marble, under the harsh glare of a single pendant light, sat a plain manila envelope. It had been delivered by a private courier 20 minutes ago, marked only with his name in stark, block letters. No return address, no corporate seal. David took a slow sip of his Macallan, the amber liquid burning a trail down his throat. His left wrist felt heavy. He glanced down at the platinum Patek Philippe watch gleaming under the lights. Emma had given it to him just 3 days ago. To 7 years of building our empire, David. I love you, she had whispered against his neck, her perfume. A heady mix of jasmine and bergamot, lingering in the air. He set the glass down. The sound of crystal clinking against marble seemed too loud in the empty apartment. Emma was out. A charity gala planning committee, she had said. She wouldn't be back until midnight. With agonizing slowness, David walked over to the island. He had already opened the envelope once, but his mind demanded a second viewing, as if hoping the contents would magically alter themselves into something benign. He slid his fingers inside and pulled out the stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. The top photograph was brutally clear. It was taken at night, outside the brick-lined alley of the Sapphire Lounge, a place David knew well. Emma was pinned against the damp brick wall. Her trench coat was pushed off one shoulder, her hands tangled desperately in the dark hair of a man whose face was partially obscured in the shadows. But Emma's face was perfectly illuminated by a passing street lamp. Her eyes were closed, her lips parted, her expression caught in a visceral, raw surrender that David hadn't seen in her for years. He felt a physical blow to his chest, a sickening drop in his stomach that made him grip the edge of the marble counter to steady himself. He flipped to the next photo. Daytime. A café pachu. Emma and the same man holding hands across a small iron table. She was laughing, that bright, breathless laugh David used to think belonged only to him. The third photo. Entering a boutique hotel on the near north side. The fourth. Leaving the same hotel 2 hours later. David's breathing grew shallow. He didn't scream. He didn't throw his glass against the wall. Instead, a terrifying, icy numbness began to spread from his chest outward, freezing the blood in his veins. He stared at his wife's face, the woman he woke up next to, the woman who had kissed him goodbye that very morning, adjusting his tie with a tender smile. "Who are you?" he thought, tracing the outline of her face on the glossy paper with a trembling thumb. The silence of the penthouse pressed in on him. He looked at the Patek Philippe on his wrist. It was 10:15 p.m. Emma would be home in less than 2 hours. She would walk through that door, kick off her heels, and ask him how his day was with that perfect, flawless smile. David carefully gathered the photos and slid them back into the envelope. He walked to his home office, opened his personal safe hidden behind a bookshelf, and locked the envelope inside. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sounding like a vault sealing away his old life. When Emma returned at 11:45 p.m., David was sitting on the leather sofa, reading a quarterly report. "Hey, honey," she called out, her voice melodic and light as she walked into the living room. She was wearing a stunning emerald green dress, her hair perfectly styled. She leaned down and pressed a warm kiss to his cheek. "Sorry I'm late. The committee meeting dragged on forever. How was your night?" David looked up into her eyes. They were clear, bright, and utterly deceitful. He smelled the faint scent of jasmine, and beneath it, something else. Something metallic. Something male. "My night," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. A dead, flat tone that didn't match the raging inferno in his chest. It was incredibly illuminating. The morning light bleeding into the penthouse was the color of bruised iron. David hadn't slept a single minute. He had spent the entire night lying perfectly rigid on the far edge of their king-sized mattress, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the stranger who wore his wife's face. Every time Emma shifted in her sleep, her hand blindly reaching out to rest against his shoulder, it took every ounce of his willpower not to recoil as if burned. Now, the sharp hiss of the espresso machine filled the kitchen. David sat at the marble island, dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. "I swear, if Emily brings up the floral arrangements for the gala one more time, I might actually lose my mind," Emma sighed, leaning against the counter. She was wearing his oversized white dress shirt, a deliberate, domestic intimacy that made David's stomach turn. Her bare legs were crossed at the ankles, and she offered him a playful, exasperated smile. "We were stuck in the boardroom at the gallery until almost 11. David stared at her mouth. He watched the way her lips moved, perfectly synchronized with a flawless, practiced lie. There was no hesitation, no nervous flutter of her eyelashes, no subtle shift in her posture. It was a masterclass in deception, so seamless and natural that for a fleeting, terrifying second, David wondered if he had hallucinated the photographs locked in his safe. 11? David repeated, his voice smooth, devoid of the jagged edges slicing his throat. "That is late. You must be exhausted." "I am," Emma murmured, walking over to him. She slid her arms around his neck from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. Her damp hair brushed against his cheek. The scent of jasmine was overwhelming. "But you're the one working yourself into the ground with the Pemberton Tech merger. You look so tense, David." Her fingers began to massage his tense neck muscles. The physical contact was sheer agony. He felt the cold metal of the platinum watch she had given him pressing against his wrist. He carefully reached up and gently, but firmly, removed her hands. "Just a lot on my mind," he said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't look back at her. "The final valuation for the merger is next week. I need to be at the office early." "All right," Emma said softly, a hint of disappointment in her voice. "Don't work too hard. Dinner tonight? Just the two of us?" "I'll let you know," David replied. He grabbed his leather briefcase and walked out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. By 8:30 a.m., David was in his corner office at Pemberton Tech, a glass sanctuary overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city below moved with chaotic purpose, completely indifferent to the fact that his world had been quietly annihilated. He bypassed his morning emails, ignored the urgent flashing light on his desk phone, and pulled out an encrypted USB drive. Before leaving the penthouse, he had scanned the clearest photograph of the man from the alley. He plugged the drive into a secure, offline terminal he used for sensitive corporate data. As the chief operating officer of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm, David had access to resources far beyond the reach of an ordinary suspicious husband. He didn't want to hire a private investigator yet. He didn't want anyone else breathing on his humiliation. Instead, He ran the high-resolution crop of the man's face through Pemberton's proprietary facial recognition software, a tool designed for high-level security clearance and background checks. The progress bar crawled across the screen. David stared at the man's face. He was conventionally handsome, perhaps a few years younger than David, with a sharp jawline and an arrogant ease in his posture even while pinned against a brick wall by a married woman. The software chimed softly. A match. The name appeared on the screen, accompanied by a digital footprint compiled from public records and corporate registries. Chad Hunter. Occupation: independent venture capitalist. David scrolled down, his eyes scanning the data. But it was the final section of the profile that made the air in the room turn to ice. Chad Hunter's primary investment portfolio was deeply entangled with Vanguard Solutions, the very rival firm actively trying to sabotage Pemberton Tech's upcoming merger. The betrayal suddenly metastasized. This wasn't just an affair born of boredom or lost passion. Emma hadn't just invited another man into their bed. She had invited a predator into their empire. David stared at the glowing monitor, the name Vanguard Solutions burning into his retinas. The sterile, ambient hum of Pemberton Tech servers beneath his feet felt entirely disconnected from the violent earthquake fracturing his reality. This was no longer just an infidelity. It was a security breach. Emma was the compromised firewall and Chad Hunter was the virus. He closed the facial recognition software and leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. The grief that had suffocated him the previous night was rapidly hardening into something else. Something cold, sharp, and terribly focused. David was a man who solved complex system failures for a living. His marriage was now the ultimate system failure, and he needed to map the blast radius. Pulling his personal encrypted laptop from his briefcase, David bypassed his usual firewalls and logged into the joint financial and cloud accounts he shared with Emma. They had always maintained an open-door policy with their digital lives, a symbol of their absolute trust. She had nothing to hide, or so he had believed. He opened her synchronized calendar on one half of the screen and their platinum credit card statements on the other. He began to scroll, his eyes scanning the data with surgical precision. He worked backward from the date stamped on the anonymous photographs. 2 weeks ago, a Tuesday. Emma's calendar listed a 4-hour block for gallery installation, modernist exhibit. David cross-referenced the date with her vehicle's GPS logs, a premium security feature he had insisted on installing when he bought her the Range Rover last Christmas. On that Tuesday, the Range Rover hadn't been parked at the downtown gallery. It had remained stationary for 3.5 hours in the VIP underground lot of the Archer Hotel, just 3 blocks away from Vanguard Solutions corporate headquarters. David's jaw tightened. He kept scrolling. Thursday, 3 weeks ago. Charity luncheon with Emily. The car was parked near the Sapphire Lounge. Tuesday, a month ago. Curator meeting. The Archer Hotel. He traced the pattern back, week by week, watching the timeline of his wife's betrayal unfold in neat, color-coded digital blocks. The sickness in his stomach returned, heavier this time. The pattern didn't start a few weeks ago. It started precisely 4 months ago. David stopped typing. The silence in his office was deafening. 4 months ago was exactly the week the board of directors had confidentially appointed him as the lead negotiator for the Pemberton Tech merger. He looked down at the Patek Philippe watch ticking against his pulse. The pieces were sliding into place with terrifying clarity. Chad Hunter hadn't simply bumped into a lonely, beautiful woman at a high-end bar and charmed her into bed. This was a targeted acquisition. Chad had identified the weakest link in David Wright's armor and exploited it to gain leverage, or perhaps access to David's home office where confidential merger documents often lay exposed on the desk. A sharp knock on the glass door shattered his concentration. David! He looked up to see Mark Stevens, the VP of Engineering, standing in the doorway holding a thick folder. Mark was one of his closest colleagues, a man who had attended his and Emma's wedding 7 years ago. The legal team needs your signature on the final non-disclosure agreements for the merger, Mark said, stepping into the room. He frowned, noticing the pale, rigid set of David's features. You okay, man? You look like you haven't slept in a week. David minimized the screens on his laptop with a swift, fluid motion. He forced the muscles in his face to relax, adopting the calm, authoritative mask of the COO. "I'm fine, Mark. Just reviewing some late-night analytics." David lied smoothly, his voice betraying nothing. He reached for the folder, his hand perfectly steady. "Leave it here. I'll have it back to legal by noon." As Mark left the office, David looked back at the blank desktop background. His wife was sleeping with a corporate spy. The profound humiliation of being cuckolded was slowly being overshadowed by a ruthless instinct for survival. Emma had made her choice, whatever her reasons were. Now David had to make his. He wouldn't just divorce her. He was going to dismantle the man who used her, and he was going to use Emma's own lies to do it. Rain had given way to a thick, suffocating fog by the time evening descended on Chicago. At 7 p.m., Emma had sent a brief, affectionate text. "Networking dinner with the gallery board. Don't wait up for me. Love you." David had simply replied, "Have a good time." Then, he had opened the GPS tracker on his encrypted laptop. The Range Rover was parked in the VIP subterranean lot of the Sapphire Lounge. David entered the establishment through the heavy mahogany doors, slipping a $100 bill to the host to secure a secluded booth in the back corner, cloaked in shadows. The Sapphire Lounge was a cavern of deep velvet and brushed brass, thrumming with the low, mournful wail of a live saxophone. It smelled of expensive bourbon, melted wax, and illicit promises. The exact kind of place where a bored wife could easily reinvent herself. He ordered a neat scotch and left it untouched. It took him less than 5 minutes to spot them. They were seated at a semicircular booth near the jazz stage, illuminated only by a flickering tabletop candle. Emma was wearing a backless black silk blouse that David had never seen before. Her hair was swept up, exposing the elegant curve of her neck. Across from her sat Chad Hunter. In person, Chad possessed a predatory stillness. He didn't hover. He lounged, his arm draped casually over the back of the velvet seat, exuding an aura of absolute, arrogant ownership. David watched from the darkness, a ghost haunting his own life. He observed the micro-interactions that no still photograph could ever capture. He saw the way Emma leaned forward, her eyes dilated, drinking in Chad's every word as if she were a woman dying of thirst. He watched Chad reach across the small table, his fingers trailing lightly over Emma's bare forearm. Emma shivered, a visceral, helpless reaction that sent a jagged shard of ice straight into David's chest. It was a masterclass in manipulation, though Emma appeared entirely blind to it. David, with his corporate strategist's mind, could see the exact mechanics of Chad's seduction. Chad was playing the attentive listener, the dangerous escape, the man who had all the time in the world for a woman whose husband was married to a multi-billion-dollar merger. But David also saw the way Chad's eyes occasionally darted toward Emma's designer handbag, where her phone, and her digital access to Pemberton Tech's home network, rested unguarded. Emma wasn't just committing adultery. She was bleeding out her husband's empire, one whispered secret at a time, entirely unaware that the man she thought desired her was merely evaluating his return on investment. The platinum Patek Philippe watch felt like a shackle against David's wrist. The second hand swept relentlessly forward. Tick, tick, tick. A sudden, violent urge gripped him. He could stand up right now. He could walk across the dim room, grab Chad by the collar of his custom Italian suit, and drag him out into the alley. He could shatter the glass illusion Emma was living in. It would be so easy to let the rage win. Instead, David forced his hands to remain flat on the oak table. He took a slow, measured breath, reining in the adrenaline. Confronting them now would satisfy his pride, but it would destroy his leverage. If Chad knew David was aware of the affair, Vanguard Solutions would immediately change tactics, striking Pemberton Tech from another, unseen angle. David had to let his wife continue to play the fool. He watched them for another agonizing hour, burning every agonizing detail into his memory. The tilt of her head, the flushed color of her cheeks, the precise moment Chad leaned in to kiss her jawline. When they finally stood up to leave, Chad's hand resting possessively on the small of Emma's back, David did not follow. He sat alone in the dark corner of the Sapphire Lounge, surrounded by the clinking of glasses and the melancholy jazz, silently accepting the absolute death of his marriage so that his life's work might survive. The Harborview restaurant was a sprawling, glass-enclosed dining room overlooking Lake Michigan, its atmosphere heavy with the scent of seared scallops and expensive Chardonnay. Friday night dinners with Mark and Emily Stevens were a tradition spanning 5 years. A comfortable, predictable routine that David had once cherished as a cornerstone of his stable, affluent life. Tonight, however, the white linen tablecloth felt like a mortuary slab. David sat perfectly composed, his charcoal suit immaculate, swirling the deep red Cabernet in his glass. Across from him, Emma was glowing. She wore a delicate pearl necklace and the easy, practiced smile of a woman entirely at peace with her world. To Mark and Emily, she was the epitome of grace. To David, she was a terrifyingly convincing sociopath. "I'm telling you, David," Mark laughed, cutting into his steak. "The new back-end architecture for the merger is going to be flawless. We ran the final stress tests this afternoon. Vanguard Solutions won't even know what hit them when we announce the acquisition." "Vanguard is always desperate," Emily chimed in, taking a sip of wine. "They don't have the infrastructure Pemberton does. They rely on aggressive tactics, not actual innovation." At the mention of Vanguard, David watched Emma over the rim of his glass. Her expression remained entirely serene, a polite, mildly interested mask. She had no idea she was sleeping with the enemy. The profound depth of her ignorance was almost tragic. Buzz. Emma's gold-cased iPhone vibrated sharply against the oak table. It was the third time in 20 minutes. She offered a quick, apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry. The gallery board is in a panic over the lighting installation for the modernist exhibit. Let me just silence this." She reached for the phone, her manicured fingers moving swiftly to tap the screen. But David, a master of observing microscopic shifts in human behavior, caught the microscopic hesitation in her breath. He saw the way her thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second too long, her eyes briefly dilating as she read the hidden notification. "Chad, it seems like the gallery demands a lot of your evening hours lately, Emma," David observed casually, his voice smooth and conversational. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "You've been out almost every night this week. They must be relying heavily on your expertise." Emma looked up, her smile tightening imperceptibly at the edges. "You know how it is with large installations, David. There are always last-minute crises. It's stressful, but it's my job." David held her gaze, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. "I suppose some crises require a more personal touch," he said softly. Silence descended on the table, broken only by the clinking of silverware from other diners. The atmosphere suddenly crackled with unseen electricity. Mark paused, a forkful of steak halfway to his mouth, glancing back and forth between David and Emma. Emily looked confused, sensing the abrupt shift in tone but unable to decipher its origin. Emma's hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass. A flicker of genuine panic flared in her eyes before she swiftly suppressed it beneath a layer of indignant surprise. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, David," she said, her voice maintaining a dangerous evenness. "My work is entirely professional." "Of course it is," David replied smoothly, leaning back and taking a slow sip of his Cabernet. The trap had been set, the bait taken. He had introduced the microscopic germ of paranoia into her perfect, insulated world. "I just worry about you burning out. It's important to know when to step back from something that demands too much of your time, especially when the returns are questionable." He let the word hang in the air, ambiguous enough to apply to her career, but razor-sharp enough to slice into her conscience. The rest of the dinner passed in a suffocating, polite blur. Emma's phone didn't buzz again. She spent the remainder of the evening slightly pale, her laughter forced, her eyes constantly darting toward David, searching his stoic features for a crack. But David gave her nothing. He was a fortress watching the enemy scramble in the dark. The weekend crawled by with the excruciating slowness of a dying man's final breaths. Emma, visibly unsettled by the dinner with Mark and Emily, had doubled down on her performance of the devoted wife. She baked David's favorite sourdough, suggested a quiet movie night, and even offered to massage his shoulders. Every touch felt like sandpaper against raw nerves. David endured it all with a terrifying, hollow calm, a man composed entirely of ice and calculated responses. By Monday morning, the heavy rain had returned, washing the Chicago streets in a cold, gray light. David sat alone in his corner office at Pemberton Tech, the door locked, the blinds drawn tight. The encrypted laptop glowed ominously on his mahogany desk. He had spent the last 48 hours not mourning his marriage, but dissecting it like a forensic accountant. The emotional shock had passed. What remained was a clinical need to understand the architecture of her deception. He opened a hidden, offshore account he had discovered buried deep within Emma's digital footprint. A secondary credit card she had opened 3 months ago under her maiden name, Sullivan, registered to a P.O. box in the suburbs. David, with his extensive network of financial analysts at Pemberton, had bypassed the security protocols in less than an hour. The spreadsheet populated on the screen, a cascading waterfall of numbers that hit David harder than the anonymous photographs had. The transactions were a relentless drumbeat of betrayal. The Archer Hotel, $450.
00 Café Lumière, $120.
00 The Sapphire Lounge, $280.
00 Boutique Lingerie, $850.
00 The list went on, month after month, meticulously chronicling an alternate life funded entirely by the wealth David had broken his back to build. The sickest realization wasn't just the sex. It was the financial audacity. Emma was paying for the hotel rooms. She was buying the expensive dinners. Chad Hunter, the supposedly wealthy venture capitalist from Vanguard Solutions, was letting David's wife foot the bill for their illicit affair. David's hands balled into tight fists, his knuckles turning stark white. He stared at a charge from 2 weeks ago. Men's luxury grooming, $300. She had bought him gifts. A dark, bitter laugh escaped David's throat, echoing in the sterile office. It was a masterpiece of humiliation. Chad wasn't just stealing corporate secrets. He was being subsidized by the very man he was trying to destroy. David hovered his mouse over the freeze account button. It would be so incredibly satisfying to watch the digital guillotine fall. He pictured Emma standing at the reception desk of the Archer Hotel, her flawless face crumbling in panic as the card was declined. He pictured the immediate, frantic phone call she would make to him, the web of lies she would have to spin on the spot. His finger twitched on the mouse. No. David exhaled sharply, pulling his hand away from the laptop. Freezing the account was a tactical error. It was an emotional reaction, not a strategic one. If he cut off the funding, Emma would instantly know she was compromised. Worse, she would warn Chad. The blackmailer would realize his cover was blown and immediately leak whatever sensitive information Emma had already inadvertently fed him regarding the Pemberton merger. To destroy Vanguard Solutions, David needed Chad Hunter to feel entirely secure. He needed the parasite to believe the host was still oblivious. David minimized the banking window and opened a secure communication channel to his lead cybersecurity architect. He typed a brief, coded message instructing the team to quietly flag and monitor all incoming and outgoing data traffic from Emma's IP address and her gallery's network, specifically looking for any encrypted drops linking back to Vanguard servers. He closed the laptop and stood up, walking over to the window. The rain continued to fall, a steady drumbeat against the glass. He checked his platinum watch. The merger announcement was only 4 days away. The final battle lines were drawn. The evidence was secured. It was time to prepare the execution chamber. Thursday evening in Chicago arrived with a creeping, damp chill that seeped through the thickest coats. Inside the penthouse of the Meridian, however, the air was entirely still, thick with the kind of oppressive silence that precedes a devastating storm. David Wright stood in the center of the expansive living room, an architect surveying a building rigged for demolition. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows offered no warmth, only a sterile, glittering backdrop to the final act of his marriage. He moved with meticulous, terrifying purpose. He had spent the last 3 days existing on black coffee and sheer, glacial willpower, compartmentalizing his rage into a finely tuned instrument of corporate and personal destruction. Today, the Pemberton Tech merger had entered its final, highly classified phase. Tonight, the charade with Emma would end. He began by stripping the room of its manufactured intimacy. He walked over to the mahogany side table and picked up a silver-framed photograph of them in Tuscany, taken during their honeymoon. Emma was laughing, her hair blowing across her face, while David looked at her with an adoration that now made him physically ill. He placed it face down on the bottom shelf. He did the same with the scattered issues of Architectural Digest she favored, the cashmere throws, and the expensive orchids she had meticulously arranged. He was sanitizing the environment, stripping away the soft edges of home, until only a cold, judicial space remained. Next, he walked to the kitchen island, the very spot where the manila envelope had waited for him a week ago. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, black portfolio, and laid it dead center on the marble. Inside the portfolio was the arsenal. The high-resolution photographs of Emma and Chad at the Sapphire Lounge and outside the Archer Hotel. A printed, highlighted ledger of the secret credit card transactions, detailing every hotel room and dinner she had financed. And finally, a devastating 4-page dossier compiled by Pemberton's cybersecurity team, linking Chad Hunter's shell companies directly to Vanguard Solutions. David checked the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. 7:45 p.m. Emma had texted earlier, wrapping up at the gallery. Bringing home sushi from Nobu. Can't wait to see you, honey. The sheer audacity of her affection was almost impressive. She was playing the devoted wife right up until the gallows trapdoor opened. David poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan. Neat. He didn't drink it. He simply held the heavy crystal tumbler, finding comfort in its solid, cold weight. He turned off all the ambient lighting in the penthouse, leaving only the harsh, surgical glare of the pendant lights directly above the kitchen island where the portfolio lay. He positioned a single leather barstool directly across from where he would stand. The stage was set. The trap was primed. At 8:15 p.m., the distinct click of the front door unlocking echoed through the cavernous apartment. "David!" Emma called out, her voice bright and breathless as she stepped into the foyer. The rustle of paper bags and the click of her Louboutins filled the silence. "I got the spicy tuna rolls you love." The traffic on Michigan Avenue was an absolute nightmare. She walked into the dimly lit living room, stopping short as she noticed the stark, unnatural arrangement of the space. Her eyes immediately snapped to the solitary figure of her husband standing behind the illuminated kitchen island, the black portfolio resting ominously before him like an altar. The bright, artificial smile on her face faltered, replaced by a flicker of profound unease. She clutched the takeout bags slightly tighter to her chest. "David?" she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, losing its melodic lilt. "Why is it so dark in here? And where are all the pictures?" David did not move. He did not blink. He simply looked at her, his expression a mask of absolute, terrifying nothingness. The time for observation was over. The execution had begun. "Put the food down, Emma," David said, his voice flat, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. "And sit." The paper bags from Nobu slipped from Emma's hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a soft, dull thud. The spicy tuna rolls David used to love scattered uselessly across the expensive rug. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly under her silk blouse. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet, the silence broken only by the rapid, frantic beating of her own heart.
"Sit," David repeated softly.
It was not a request. It was a gravitational pull, heavy and absolute. Emma moved mechanically, her Louboutins clicking hesitantly against the floorboards until she reached the solitary leather barstool positioned under the harsh pendant light. She sat down, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked at the black portfolio resting on the marble island between them, a physical manifestation of her impending doom. David remained standing. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a glass against the wall. His stillness was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He reached out and flipped the cover of the portfolio open. "I've always admired your attention to detail, Emma," David began, his voice maintaining a almost conversational cadence that sent a violent shudder down her spine. "The gallery events, the late-night installations, the way you managed your schedule so meticulously. It was a very impressive performance." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. "David, what is this? You're scaring me." "Am I?" he asked smoothly, sliding the first photograph across the smooth marble. It stopped directly in front of her. The alleyway outside the Sapphire Lounge. The desperate kiss. The trench coat pushed off her shoulder. Emma flinched violently, as if the photograph itself had physically struck her. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashy and pale. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The flawless mask she had worn for months shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces in a matter of seconds. "The Sapphire Lounge," David narrated calmly, his eyes never leaving her face. "A classic choice. Though, I must admit, I was slightly disappointed by your lack of imagination." "David, I can explain?" she stammered, tears instantly welling in her eyes, hot and fast. It's not what you think, isn't it?" David asked, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. He slid the second photograph across the table. "The Archer Hotel. Tuesday 3 weeks ago. 2 hours and 45 minutes. You told me you were at a curator meeting." Emma began to weep, low, broken sobs that tore from her chest. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of the photograph, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She looked up at David, her eyes pleading, desperate for a crack in his armor, for a glimpse of the husband she knew. But she found only a stranger, a man composed entirely of ice and calculated vengeance. "David, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "It was a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake. I was so lonely. You were always working. You were always at Pemberton. I needed to feel seen." David's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only sign that her words had registered. He didn't respond to her tears. Instead, he reached into the portfolio and pulled out the printed ledger of her secret credit card transactions. He laid it flat on the table, tapping the highlighted numbers with a manicured fingernail. "A mistake implies a momentary lapse in judgment, Emma," David said coldly. "Opening a hidden offshore account under your maiden name is not a mistake. Financing a secondary life, paying for hotel rooms and extravagant dinners for a man who claims to be a wealthy venture capitalist, that is a sustained, calculated campaign of deceit." Emma stared at the ledger, the sheer volume of her lies laid bare before her. The reality of what she had done, the magnitude of her betrayal, finally crushed her. She slumped forward, resting her head on her arms on the cold marble, her shoulders shaking violently with uncontrollable sobs. David watched her weep. He felt no pity. He felt nothing but the cold, hard certainty of what had to come next. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. "Now, Emma," he said, the ice in his tone hardening into steel. "Tell me exactly what you've given Chad Hunter from my home office." Emma's sobs hitched in her throat, catching on the sharp, jagged edge of David's question. She lifted her head from the marble island, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale, tear-stained cheeks. The absolute confusion in her red-rimmed eyes was the most genuine expression David had seen on her face in months. "What?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread. "What are you talking about? Chad is in venture capital. He invests in green energy startups. He doesn't care about Pemberton Tech." David felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. Her ignorance wasn't an act. She was truly, profoundly oblivious to the predator she had invited into their bed. He stared down at her, the woman he had loved, reduced to a shivering, pathetic pawn. He didn't yell. He didn't blink. He simply reached into the black portfolio and slowly slid the final document across the slick marble surface. It was the 4-page cybersecurity dossier, stamped with the red confidential seal of Pemberton Tech, Chad Hunter. David stated, his voice as sterile as a scalpel cutting through flesh, is not a venture capitalist interested in green energy, Emma. He is a senior operative for Vanguard Solutions. They are currently attempting a hostile takeover to derail our merger next week. Emma stared blankly at the Pemberton seal, her mind struggling to process the monumental shift in reality. The man who had whispered poetry into her ear, who had made her feel vibrant and desired in the dimly lit booths of the Sapphire Lounge, was a corporate phantom. No, Emma gasped, violently shaking her head, as if the physical motion could dislodge the truth. No, David, you're wrong. He loves me. He said he was going to leave his firm. He said we were going to Paris. He let you pay for his hotel rooms, Emma? David countered smoothly, his tone entirely devoid of pity. He tapped the highlighted offshore credit card statement still resting near her elbow. He let you finance your own seduction because it kept him off the grid, kept his name out of the hotel registries. And while you were blinded by the romance of a cheap affair, he was mapping my home network. Emma recoiled as if she had been struck. The air seemed to rush out of her lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the memories of the past 4 months began to recontextualize themselves. The gallery gala, last month, she stammered, her voice trembling violently. You were in London. I brought him here. Just once. I swear, David, just once. David's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He leaned over the marble island, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a cold, controlled fury. And while you were pouring him a drink, where was he, Emma? Emma closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling over her lashes as a sickening realization washed over her. He said he needed to use the restroom. He was gone for, maybe 10 minutes. I thought he was just nervous. 10 minutes is an eternity for a man with a localized USB sniffer, David said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with sickening precision. He cloned the encrypted drive I left in the safe. He mirrored my laptop's access protocols. Emma broke down completely. She slid off the bar stool, falling to her knees on the hardwood floor amidst the scattered sushi rolls. She reached out, her hands desperately gripping the fabric of David's trousers, weeping with a raw, agonizing desperation. I didn't know, David. I swear to God, I didn't know. She sobbed, burying her face against his leg. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. He used me. He used my loneliness. Please, you have to believe me. David looked down at his wife, kneeling in the ruins of their life. He felt no vindication. He felt no triumph. He only felt the heavy, suffocating weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire teetering on the edge of destruction. All because the woman he married had needed to feel seen by a stranger in a bar. I believe you were lonely, Emma, David said softly, stepping back and dislodging her frantic grip. He looked at the Patek Philippe watch she had given him. It was a beautiful, hollow gesture. But ignorance is not an alibi. You handed him the knife, and now I have to stop him from cutting my throat. Emma remained on the floor, a crumpled heap of silk and devastating regret. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of modern luxury, now felt like a sterile interrogation room. David walked around the marble island, his footsteps muffled by the expensive rug, leaving her weeping quietly amidst the ruins of their Friday night dinner. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't offer comfort. He walked to the entryway console and picked up her gold-cased iPhone. Returning to the kitchen, he dropped it flat on the counter next to the damning portfolio. The sharp clack of the metal casing made Emma flinch. Get up, Emma, David commanded. His voice was no longer that of a betrayed husband. It was the chilling, authoritative tone of the chief operating officer of Pemberton Tech orchestrating a crisis response. Emma sniffled loudly, slowly pushing herself up off the floor. Her hands shook violently as she wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, leaving dark, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. She leaned heavily against the barstool, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the glacial emptiness in his eyes. "Unlock it," David said, pointing at the phone. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final, pathetic instinct to protect the illusion of her private life, before pressing her thumb to the sensor. The screen bloomed to life, displaying a lock-screen photo of a sunset she had taken from the balcony of the Archer Hotel. David felt a brief, nauseating spike of adrenaline, but he ruthlessly suppressed it. "Open your messages with Chad," he instructed, sliding the phone back toward her. Emma's trembling fingers tapped the screen. The thread opened, a sickeningly long scroll of blue and gray bubbles. Late-night promises, hotel room numbers, and digital kisses that had cost David his marriage. "He thinks he has the final valuation numbers for the merger," David stated, his voice flat and analytical. "The data he skimmed from my laptop during his 10-minute excursion in my home office was encrypted, but Vanguard's decryption algorithms are aggressive. If he hasn't cracked it yet, he will by Monday morning." Emma looked up at him, her chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. What do you want me to do, David? I'll do anything. Please." "You are going to text him," David said, leaning slightly closer over the marble, his presence suffocatingly intense. "You are going to tell him that I am in a panic, that the merger is falling apart because the board discovered a massive, undisclosed liability in the target company's pension fund. You will tell him I left my unlocked laptop on the dining table while I was screaming at the legal team on the phone, and you saw the email." Emma stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and sheer terror. The man standing before her was not the predictable, slightly overworked husband she had grown bored with. He was a predator, far colder and more dangerous than Chad Hunter could ever hope to be. "David, he might not believe me," Emma stammered, her voice thin. "He's careful. He always asks for proof. He's greedy, Emma, and greed makes men stupid." David countered smoothly, his eyes never leaving hers. "He spent 4 months grooming you for access. He believes he owns you. He believes you are utterly devoted to him and resentful of me. This is the exact kind of emotional, sloppy intelligence leak he has been waiting for." He tapped the screen of her phone with a manicured nail. "Type exactly what I tell you. Do not use your standard abbreviations. Use the desperate, breathless tone you reserve for him when you're begging him to meet you at the Sapphire Lounge." Emma choked back a fresh sob, the brutal humiliation of his words landing like physical blows. But she picked up the phone. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard, shaking so badly she could barely target the letters. "Start typing, Emma," David commanded quietly, "or I will call security, have you removed from this building, and I will let Vanguard burn Pemberton to the ground just so I can watch you burn with it." With a trembling breath, Emma began to type the lie that would save her husband's empire and seal the coffin of her affair. The digital clock on the microwave read 11:42 p.m. The penthouse was enveloped in a suffocating silence, the air thick with the acrid scent of adrenaline and the metallic tang of betrayal. The paper bags from Nobu still lay scattered on the hardwood floor, a grotesque reminder of the domestic normalcy Emma had tried to fake just a few hours ago. David stood motionless by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. The city was a grid of indifferent lights, perfectly unaware of the multi-billion-dollar war being waged in his living room. He held his crystal tumbler of Macallan, the ice long melted, the amber liquid warm and untouched. Behind him, sitting on the leather barstool beneath the harsh glare of the pendant light, Emma looked fragile and utterly destroyed. She was clutching her gold-cased iPhone with both hands, her knuckles stark white, her eyes glued to the illuminated screen. She had been staring at the read receipt for 20 agonizing minutes. "He's not answering," Emma whispered, her voice cracking, a thin, panicked edge threading through her words. "David, he's read it, but he hasn't answered. What if he knows? What if he knows I'm lying?" David did not turn around. The cold reflection of his own face in the glass was the only company he desired. He is consulting with Vanguard's legal team, Emma. They are calculating the risk. If the target company's pension fund truly is insolvent, Pemberton Tech is buying a toxic asset. It changes their entire strategy. But what if they don't believe me? She pleaded, fresh tears welling in her exhausted eyes. He always said I was terrible at keeping my emotions in check. That is exactly why they will believe you, David replied smoothly, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. He finally turned to face her, his expression a mask of chilling composure. They expect a frantic, resentful wife to overreact to her husband's panic. You are playing the role they assigned to you, Emma. Perfectly. The phone vibrated violently against the marble island, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Emma jumped, letting out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Read it, David commanded, closing the distance between them in 3 swift strides. Emma snatched the phone up, her thumbs fumbling over the screen. Her eyes widened, scanning the text, the color draining further from her already pale face. She looked up at David, terrified. He wants proof, she stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. He says he needs a picture of the document. He says if I really love him, if I really want us to go away together, I need to send him a photo of the email from the board. Right now. David felt a cold, hard knot form in his chest. Chad Hunter was a professional. He wasn't going to bet a corporate espionage campaign on the hysterical text of a compromised asset without verification. The trap was closing, but Vanguard was demanding bait. David reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his encrypted corporate smartphone. With practiced, mechanical precision, he bypassed the security protocols and opened a secure file labeled drafts. He didn't hesitate. He brought up a highly classified internal memo, a document he had spent the last 3 days meticulously forging with the help of Pemberton's chief legal counsel, specifically designed to look like a frantic, late-night communication regarding a devastating pension liability. It was embedded with a digital watermark that would immediately alert Pemberton's servers the moment Vanguard attempted to download or verify its source code. He placed his phone flat on the marble, right next to Emma's. The screen glowed with the forged document. Take a picture, David ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. Make sure the edge of my coffee cup and the Pemberton letterhead are visible. Make it look rushed. Make it look like you're terrified of being caught. Emma stared at the screen, her mind reeling at the sheer magnitude of the deception. The man she had married was orchestrating a counter-espionage operation on their kitchen counter with the same clinical detachment he used to dissect quarterly earnings. David, please, she begged, her voice barely audible, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. If I send this, there's no going back. He'll know I betrayed him. David looked down at his wife, feeling nothing but a profound, exhausting emptiness. The rage had burned itself out, leaving only ash. You betrayed him the moment you sat down on that stool, Emma, David said coldly, tapping the marble next to the phone. And you betrayed me 4 months ago in the Sapphire Lounge. The only difference is this time you are bleeding for my company, not his. Take the picture. Trembling violently, Emma picked up her phone, aligned the camera, and snapped the photo. With a choked sob, she hit send. The penthouse remained frozen in time. Only the rhythmic ticking of the platinum Patek Philippe watch on David's wrist marked the agonizing passage of seconds. Emma sat huddled over the marble island, her face buried in her arms, the quiet, jagged sounds of her weeping the only accompaniment to the distant hum of Chicago traffic. Then, David's encrypted corporate smartphone lit up. A single, muted chime cut through the heavy, suffocating air. David picked it up. A secure message from his lead cybersecurity architect flashed on the screen. Payload delivered. Vanguard servers have ingested the watermarked file. Their primary network is executing our containment loop. The threat is neutralized. The merger is secure. David exhaled a long, slow breath. The invisible, crushing weight that had been compressing his chest for the past week finally lifted. In its place, however, he did not find relief or triumph. He found only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He locked the phone and slid it back into his breast pocket. He had won the multi-billion-dollar war, but the battlefield was his own home, and there were no survivors to celebrate with. "It's done," David said quietly. His voice carried no inflection, only the flat cadence of a finalized corporate transaction. "They took the bait. Vanguard is crippled." Emma slowly raised her head from the cold stone. Her face was a tragic canvas of smeared makeup, her eyes swollen and bloodshot. The sheer terror that had kept her upright during the digital counterstrike rapidly evaporated, leaving behind the devastating, inescapable reality of what she had done and what she was about to lose. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling violently as she reached across the marble. Her fingers stopped just inches from his hand, afraid to make contact. "Thank God. Your company, your life's work is safe." She searched his stoic features, desperately looking for a flicker of the man who used to hold her, the man who had built this beautiful, broken life with her. "We did it. We fixed it. Please, David, let me make this right. I'll go to therapy. We can move away from Chicago. Whatever you want. I love you. Those 7 years we had, they have to mean something." David looked down at her outstretched, trembling hand. He remembered the day he had slipped the wedding band onto her finger, the absolute, unwavering certainty he had felt standing in that sunlit chapel. It felt like a memory belonging to a stranger, a ghost from a life that no longer existed. "They meant everything, Emma," David replied softly. The simmering rage that had fueled him for days was entirely gone, replaced by a bittersweet acceptance that felt infinitely heavier than grief. "But the woman who stood at that altar with me doesn't exist anymore. She died in the alleyway behind the Sapphire Lounge. And the man who loved her died the moment he opened that manila envelope." "No," Emma sobbed, violently shaking her head, her tears dripping onto the pristine surface of the island. "People make mistakes, David. People forgive. We can rebuild this." David didn't answer immediately. He looked around the dimly lit penthouse, the expensive Persian rug stained with spilled takeout, the dark portfolio of her sins resting heavily on the counter, the oppressive, echoing silence of a dead marriage. He reached for his left hand. With slow, deliberate movements, David slid the platinum wedding band off his ring finger. The metal felt suddenly cold and alien, leaving a pale, phantom indentation on his skin where a promise used to live. He placed the ring on the marble island, right beside the photograph of her caught in Chad Hunter's arms. The soft clink of the gold against the stone was the final, definitive punctuation of their shared history. He picked up his leather briefcase from the floor. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't need anything else from this beautiful mausoleum. Emma stared at the ring on the table, a fresh wave of agony tearing a visceral, guttural sob from her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "Please!" she choked out into the empty air, completely broken. David paused at the edge of the kitchen, looking back at her one last time. The city lights cast a pale, unforgiving glow over the wreckage of their life. "Some things can be fixed, Emma, but a shattered mirror only makes you bleed if you try to put it back together." He turned and walked toward the heavy oak door, the sound of his footsteps steady and absolute, leaving her alone in the dark.